George Miller loved his morning routine. At 76 years old, he'd wake up at 6, make himself a strong cup of coffee, and head out to his front porch to watch the neighborhood come alive. He'd lived in that same house for almost 40 years. Bought it back when his kids were still in elementary school. Back when the mortgage felt impossible, but somehow they made it work. Now the house was paid off. His wife had passed 3 years ago. And it was just him and his memories in that little 3-bedroom home on Maple Street. The garden was his pride and joy. Roses along the fence, tomatoes in the back, and a small collection of garden gnomes that his grandkids had given him over the years. Some people might think garden gnomes are tacky, but George didn't care. Each one represented a birthday, a Christmas, a random Tuesday when one of the kids wanted to make him smile. They made him happy, and at his age, that's all that mattered. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when everything changed. George was outside trimming his hedges when a black sedan pulled up in front of his house. 2 men got out, both wearing matching navy blue polo shirts with some kind of logo embroidered on them. They looked official, carrying clipboards and folders. The kind of look that makes you think they're here on business. The taller one, a man in his 40s with slicked back hair and expensive sunglasses, walked up George's driveway with confidence. The second guy was shorter, stockier, with a thick neck and the build of someone who spent time in the gym. They both had fake smiles plastered on their faces. "Good morning, sir," the tall one said, not bothering to remove his sunglasses. "Are you the homeowner here?" George set down his hedge trimmers and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Sure am. Been the homeowner for 40 years.
Can I help you gentlemen with something?"
The tall man pulled out a business card and handed it to George. It read, Oakwood Hills Community Association, with some official-looking seal and a phone number. "I'm Director Stevens, and this is my associate, Mr. Rivera. We're from the HOA, and I'm afraid we have some serious matters to discuss with you." George looked at the card, confused.
"Ho? There's no Ho in this neighborhood."
"Never has been." The man calling himself Stevens let out a long sigh like he was dealing with a difficult child. "Sir, I understand there may have been some confusion, but this neighborhood was incorporated into the Oakwood Hills Community Association back in 2019. All homeowners received notification by certified mail. I never got any mail about an HOA," George said firmly. He wasn't the type to forget something like that. "And I know my neighbors. We would have talked about it. Nobody's ever mentioned an HOA. The stocky one, Rivera, stepped forward. "Sir, whether you received the notification or not doesn't change the fact that you're in violation of multiple community standards. We've documented at least 8 separate infractions on your property." George felt his heart rate pick up. Something wasn't right here. "Infractions? What are you talking about?" Stevens opened his folder and made a show of flipping through papers. "Unapproved decorative items in the front yard, specifically those garden ornaments. Your house exterior paint color is not on the approved list. Your mailbox doesn't meet specifications. The hedge height exceeds community standards. Your trash cans are visible from the street. Should I continue?" "Those garden gnomes are from my grandkids," George said, feeling defensive now. "And I painted this house 5 years ago. Nobody said anything then." "Well, someone's saying something now," Rivera said, his tone getting harder. "You owe $8,500 in back fees and fines. Payment is due immediately." George actually laughed. He couldn't help it. The whole thing was so ridiculous. $8,000? For garden gnomes and paint? You two must think I'm senile or something. I'm not paying you a dime." Stevens's fake smile disappeared. "Sir, this is not optional. These are legal fees assessed by the Homeowners Association. If you refuse to pay, we're authorized to place a lien on your property." "Get off my property," George said, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "Right now, and don't come back." That's when Rivera moved closer, invading George's personal space. "You don't want to make this difficult, old man. Just write the check and we'll be on our way." George stood his ground. "I said get off my property. I'm calling the police." He turned to go back into his house, reaching for the phone in his pocket. That's when Stevens grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. George stumbled on the porch steps, trying to catch himself. Rivera grabbed his left arm to steady him, but instead of helping, he yanked it hard, twisting it at an unnatural angle. The pain was instant and overwhelming. George heard a crack that seemed to echo in his ears, and then his arm exploded in agony. He fell to his knees, gasping. Through the haze of pain, he heard Rivera say something to Stevens. The two men were already backing away, moving quickly toward their car. George's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, from across the street, was outside watering her flowers. She saw the whole thing. Her scream cut through the quiet suburban morning as she dropped her hose and ran toward George. "Don't move, George. I'm calling 911, she shouted, already pulling out her phone. The black sedan peeled away from the curb, tires squealing. George was on the ground now, cradling his arm. The pain was unlike anything he'd experienced. His arm was bent wrong and he could see swelling already starting. He felt dizzy, nauseous. Mrs. Patterson knelt beside him, still on the phone with emergency services. Her voice sounded far away. Other neighbors were coming out of their houses now, drawn by the commotion. Someone brought a chair. Someone else brought water. Everyone was asking what happened, if he was okay. Who were those men? The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes, though it felt like hours to George. The paramedics were gentle, but every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his arm. They gave him something for the pain, loaded him onto a stretcher, and rushed him to County General Hospital. In the emergency room, X-rays confirmed what George already knew. His arm was badly broken. Not just a simple fracture either. The doctor, a young woman who looked too young to be a doctor, explained that he had a compound fracture of his radius and ulna. The bones had been broken with enough force that they'd need surgery to set them properly. They'd have to insert pins and plates. He'd need months of physical therapy. As George lay in the hospital bed waiting for surgery, his arm immobilized and pumped full of painkillers, he kept replaying the scene in his mind. Those men weren't from any HOA. They were thieves, con artists. They'd come to his house expecting to scare an old man into handing over thousands of dollars. When he'd refused and tried to call for help, they'd hurt him. Broken his arm like it was nothing. The police came to take his statement. Officer Rodriguez was sympathetic but not particularly encouraging. George described the men, the business card, everything he could remember. The officer took photos of the card and said they'd investigate, but George could tell from his tone that the chances of catching these guys were slim. They'd probably hit other neighborhoods, other elderly people living alone. They knew what they were doing. George's daughter was already on her way, flying in from out of state. His son was driving down and would be there by morning. But as he lay there in that hospital bed, waiting for surgery, waiting for his family, George felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt vulnerable, afraid. Those men had come to his home, the place where he'd raised his family, where he'd said goodbye to his wife, where he'd planned to live out his remaining years in peace. They'd violated that sanctuary and hurt him in his own front yard. What George didn't know yet was that his 3 grandsons were also on their way. And they weren't just coming to visit their injured grandfather. They were coming for justice. The surgery took 3 hours. They had to insert 2 metal plates and 6 screws to hold George's broken bones together. When he woke up in the recovery room, groggy and disoriented, the first face he saw was his daughter Linda. She'd been crying. He could tell from her red eyes and the way she immediately grabbed his good hand. "Dad, oh my God, Dad," she whispered. "I got here as fast as I could." George tried to smile, but his mouth was dry from the anesthesia. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Takes more than a couple of thugs to keep your old man down." But he wasn't okay, not really. His arm was in a heavy cast, elevated on pillows. The doctor said he'd be in the hospital for at least 3 days to make sure there were no complications. At his age, broken bones were serious business. Infection was a risk. Blood clots were a risk. Everything was more complicated when you were 76. Linda stayed by his bedside all night, dozing in the uncomfortable hospital chair. In the morning, his son Robert arrived with his wife. More tears, more hugs, more anger when George explained what had happened. Robert wanted to go to the police station immediately, wanted to hire a private investigator, wanted to do something. "The police are already working on it," George said, though even he didn't sound convinced. Officer Rodriguez said they'd follow up on those business cards, see if they can track down the car. "That's not good enough," Robert said, pacing the small hospital room. "Those men assaulted you, Dad. They broke your arm. They could have killed you if you'd hit your head on those steps." It was true, and George knew it. He'd been lucky in the worst possible way. The hospital room got crowded over the next few hours as more family members arrived. George's brother came. His sister-in-law. Neighbors stopped by with flowers and well wishes. But the arrival everyone was waiting for came that afternoon. George heard them before he saw them. The deep rumble of motorcycle engines echoed through the hospital parking lot, a sound that made nurses glance nervously out the windows. Then came the sound of heavy boots in the hallway, the jingle of chains, the creak of leather jackets. His 3 grandsons walked into the hospital room like they owned the place. Tyler, Brandon, and Cole, the sons of his 2 children, though you wouldn't know they were related by looking at them. Tyler was the oldest at 33, tall and broad-shouldered with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos. Brandon was 30, lean and wiry with sharp eyes that never stopped moving. Cole was the youngest at 27, but at 6'4", he was the most physically imposing. All 3 wore leather vests with patches identifying them as members of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club. Tyler was the president of their chapter, which meant he was in charge of about 40 other bikers who rode together, worked together, and considered each other family. "Grandpa," Tyler said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. He approached the bed carefully, like George might break if he moved too fast. "Who did this to you?" George felt tears prick his eyes. His grandsons had always been protective of him, even when they were little boys. When other kids made fun of Tyler for being chubby in middle school, George had taught him how to box in the garage. When Brandon got into trouble with some gang members in high school, George had driven him to school every day and picked him up until things cooled down. When Cole's father died in a car accident, George had stepped up, teaching the boy how to change oil, fix a leaky faucet, be a man. Now these boys, grown men who'd chosen a lifestyle that most people didn't understand, stood in his hospital room looking ready to go to war. George told them everything. The fake HOA agents, the ridiculous demands, the way Rivera had twisted his arm when he'd tried to go inside and call the police. He showed them the business card, which the police had photographed but left with him. He described the car, the license plate numbers he'd managed to glimpse. The 3 cousins listened in silence, but George could see their jaws clenching, their hands balling into fists. Brandon kept cracking his knuckles. Cole's face had gone completely blank, which anyone who knew him understood meant he was furious. When George finished, Tyler pulled out his phone and took pictures of the business card. "What did the cops say?" "They said they'd investigate," Robert interjected. "But basically they told us not to expect much. These guys are probably professionals who've done this before." "Did they check security cameras in the neighborhood?" Brandon asked. "Mrs. Patterson's house has a camera," George said. "Caught part of it, but the angle wasn't great. You can see the car, but not the full license plate. Police have the footage." Tyler nodded slowly, his mind clearly working. "And the hospital has all your medical records? Documentation of the injury?" "Everything," Linda confirmed. "Why?" "Because when we find these guys, we want to make sure there's no question about what they did." Tyler looked at his brothers. "We need to have a church meeting." In motorcycle club terminology, a church meeting meant the members gathered to discuss important club business. Usually it meant voting on new members, dealing with internal disputes, or planning club events. But sometimes it meant something else. Sometimes it meant the club was about to handle a problem that the normal channels couldn't or wouldn't address. "Tyler, what are you planning?" Linda asked, worry creeping into her voice. She loved her nephews, but she also knew their world could be dangerous. "We're going to find the men who hurt Grandpa," Tyler said simply, "and we're going to make sure they face consequences." "The police," Robert started. "The police are doing their job," Cole interrupted, speaking for the first time. His voice was deep and calm. "And we'll do ours." Over the next 2 days, while George recovered in the hospital, his grandsons got to work. Tyler called an emergency meeting of the Iron Wolves at their clubhouse, a warehouse on the edge of town that they'd converted into a space where they could work on their bikes, hang out, and handle club business. About 30 bikers showed up. These men came from all walks of life. There was Danny, who owned a construction company. Rick, who was a paramedic. Frank, a retired Marine. They might look intimidating with their leather and tattoos, but most of them were working guys with families, jobs, and responsibilities. The club was their brotherhood, their escape from the regular world. Tyler stood in front of them and explained what had happened to George. He showed them pictures of the business card, described the men, showed them the grainy security footage from the neighbor's camera. "These men came to our president's grandfather's house," Tyler said, his voice carrying through the room. "They tried to scam him, and when he stood up to them, they broke his arm. He's 76 years old. He served in Vietnam." He worked 40 years at the steel mill. He doesn't deserve this. The room erupted in angry murmurs. In the biker world, family was everything. An attack on one member's family was an attack on the entire club. What do you need? Danny asked. Information, Brandon answered. He'd already set up a laptop and projector, displaying what they knew so far. These guys are running a fake HOA scam. They're not just random criminals. They're organized. They have fake business cards. They're targeting elderly homeowners, which means they've probably done this before. Rick raised his hand. I know a guy who's a bail bondsman. He deals with scammers and con artists all the time. Maybe he's seen these guys before. Good, Tyler said. Reach out to him. Anyone else have connections that might help? Frank spoke up. I've got a buddy who's a detective in the next county over. I can ask him if they've had similar cases. Do it, Tyler agreed. But keep it quiet. We don't want to interfere with the actual police investigation. Cole had been quiet, standing against the wall with his arms crossed. What about the car? We've got a partial plate and a description. Black sedan, tinted windows. We've got members all over the city, Tyler said. We see everything on the roads. I want everyone keeping their eyes open for that car. If you spot it, you don't approach. You call it in to me immediately. One of the younger members, a guy named Joey who worked at an auto body shop, raised his hand. Boss, I can check with my network. See if anyone's had that car come through for any work. Guys like this, they might be getting their tints done, their plates changed, whatever. Good thinking, Tyler said. The meeting lasted for 2 hours. By the end, every member of the Iron Wolves had an assignment. Some were tasked with reaching out to their networks in law enforcement, bail bonds, and the criminal underworld. Others were assigned to patrol different areas of the city, keeping watch for the black sedan. A few members who had tech skills were tasked with researching similar scams in the area, trying to find patterns. Brandon took on the role of information coordinator. He set up a shared document where everyone could report what they'd learned. Within 24 hours, they had their first breakthrough. Rick's bail bondsman friend recognized the description of the tall man. Director Stevens. His real name was Carl Hutchins, and he had warrants out for fraud in 2 different states. He usually worked with a partner named Raymond Delgado, who matched the description of Mr. Rivera. The bail bondsman even had last known addresses, though they were probably outdated. Frank's detective friend confirmed that there had been at least 6 similar incidents in surrounding counties over the past year. Elderly homeowners approached by fake HOA representatives, threatened with liens and legal actio. Finding Carl Hutchins and Raymond Delgado turned out to be easier than anyone expected. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Joey, the young club member who worked at the auto body shop. Joey had put the word out to every shop, garage and parts dealer he knew, asking if anyone had seen a black sedan matching the description. 2 days after the hospital meeting, he got a call from his buddy who ran a discount tire shop across town. A black sedan had come in the previous week for new tires. The customer paid cash and gave a fake name, but the shop kept records of the work done, including the full license plate number. Brandon ran the plates through a contact he had at the DMV. The car was registered to a shell corporation with a P.O. box address, just like the business cards. But Brandon didn't stop there. He cross-referenced the corporate filings and found a name buried in the paperwork. A woman named Patricia Hutchins, probably Carl's wife or sister. From there, it was simple detective work. Brandon found Patricia's social media accounts, which were set to public. She posted photos constantly, her kids, her garden, her house. She'd even tagged her location in several posts. It was a rental property in a run-down neighborhood about 40 miles from George's house, in a part of town where people minded their own business. Tyler called another church meeting. This time, only the core members attended, about 15 of the most trusted Iron Wolves. He showed them the address, the photos, everything they'd gathered. We've been watching the place for the past day, Brandon explained, clicking through surveillance photos on his laptop. Hutchins and Delgado are definitely there. They come and go at irregular times. Sometimes they're gone for hours, probably out running scams on other people. Sometimes they're home all day. What's the play? Danny asked. Tyler leaned forward, his expression serious. We're not going to hurt them. That's not what this is about. Some of the members looked disappointed, but most nodded in agreement. The Iron Wolves had a reputation to protect. They couldn't afford to cross the line into vigilante violence no matter how much they wanted revenge. So what then? Rick asked. We're going to make their lives miserable, Cole said, speaking up from his spot against the wall. We're going to make them so uncomfortable, so paranoid, so scared, that they'll have no choice but to turn themselves in. Tyler smiled grimly. Exactly. We're going to be their shadows. Everywhere they go, we're going to be there. Not threatening them, not touching them, just watching. Being visible. Reminding them that we know who they are and what they did. Psychological warfare, Frank said, nodding approvingly. I like it, but there's more, Brandon added. While we're making them sweat, I'm going to be digging deeper. These guys have been running scams for years. They've got to have evidence, bank accounts, victim lists, emails, texts. If I can get access to their devices or accounts, I can hand law enforcement everything they need to put these guys away for a long time. How are you going to get access? Joey asked. Brandon just smiled. Leave that to me. The campaign started the next day. It was a Saturday morning when Carl Hutchins stepped out of his rental house to walk to the corner store for cigarettes. He made it half a block before he noticed them. 6 motorcycles were parked across the street from his house. The riders sat on their bikes, engines off, just watching. All of them wore Iron Wolves colors. All of them had their eyes locked on Hutchins. Hutchins froze for a moment, then hurried toward the store, glancing over his shoulder. The bikers didn't follow, didn't move, just watched. When he came back 10 minutes later, they were still there. Same position, same silent stares. Hutchins practically ran into his house and slammed the door. Inside, Raymond Delgado was eating cereal and watching TV. What's wrong with you? There's bikers outside, Hutchins said, peering through the blinds. Just sitting there, watching the house. Delgado got up and looked out the window. So what? It's a free country. They're probably just hanging out. 6 of them, all wearing the same colors, just sitting there staring at our house. You're being paranoid, but Hutchins wasn't being paranoid. The bikers stayed for 3 hours, then rode away. But they came back that evening. This time it was a different group. 8 of them parked under the streetlight directly across from the house. They stayed until midnight. The next morning, when Hutchins went to check his car, there were 2 bikers sitting on the curb next to where he'd parked. They were drinking coffee, chatting casually, but their bikes were right there, and they watched him the entire time he walked to his car. Morning, one of them said pleasantly. Hutchins didn't respond. His hands shook as he unlocked his car. The bikers didn't move, didn't threaten, just watched him drive away. He made it 2 blocks before he noticed the motorcycle in his rearview mirror. Just one bike, keeping pace with him, maintaining a steady distance. When he turned, the bike turned. When he stopped at a red light, the bike stopped behind him. Hutchins drove to a gas station, pulled in, and got out. The biker pulled in too, parking a few spots away. The rider got off his bike and casually started pumping gas, but his eyes never left Hutchins. It went on like that all day. Everywhere Hutchins went, there was at least one Iron Wolves member nearby. Not following too close, not saying anything threatening, just there. Always there, watching. By the 3rd day, both Hutchins and Delgado were rattled. They started arguing about what to do. Delgado wanted to confront the bikers, maybe threaten them back. Hutchins wanted to leave town immediately, but every time they discussed leaving, they'd look out the window and see more motorcycles parked on their street. Meanwhile, Brandon was working his magic. He'd been monitoring their internet usage through the rental house's Wi-Fi network. It wasn't hard to hack into an unsecured connection, and these guys weren't exactly tech-savvy. He could see every website they visited, every email they sent. What he found was a goldmine. Hutchins and Delgado kept detailed records of all their scams. They had spreadsheets listing victims, amounts collected, dates, addresses. They had emails discussing future targets. They even had photos they'd taken of elderly homeowners' houses, presumably scouting for their next marks. Brandon downloaded everything, organized it meticulously, and prepared a comprehensive package. But he didn't send it to the police yet. He wanted to wait until the timing was perfect. On the 4th day of the surveillance campaign, Hutchins snapped. He came storming out of his house, marching toward the 4 bikers who were parked across the street. "What do you want?" he screamed. "Why are you following us?" Tyler was one of the bikers there that day. He sat calmly on his motorcycle, arms crossed, and just looked at Hutchins. "Didn't say a word. I'll call the cops," Hutchins threatened. You can't harass people like this. We're not harassing anyone, Tyler said calmly. We're just sitting here. This is a public street. We have every right to be here. You're following me. You're watching my house. Tyler shrugged. Can't help what you think. We're just enjoying the weather. Hutchins looked like he wanted to take a swing at Tyler, but he wasn't that stupid. 4 bikers sat between him and Tyler. All of them bigger than Hutchins, all of them ready. Instead, Hutchins stormed back to his house. He did call the police. A patrol car came by an hour later. The officers talked to the bikers first, asking what they were doing. Tyler explained politely that they were just hanging out in the neighborhood, breaking no laws. The officers checked IDs, found nothing wrong, and then went to talk to Hutchins. Whatever Hutchins told them, it wasn't enough. The police left without taking any action. The bikers stayed. That night, things escalated in a different way. Hutchins and Delgado decided to make a run for it. They loaded their car with their important belongings, waited until midnight, and quietly tried to leave. They made it to the car just fine. Started the engine. Put it in drive. And the car lurched forward about 10 feet before the engine sputtered and died. What the hell? Delgado tried starting it again. Nothing. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. Hutchins got out and popped the hood. Even in the dark, he could see the problem. Someone had poured something into the gas tank. The engine was completely flooded with contaminated fuel. From the shadows across the street, Cole watched with satisfaction. The sugar had worked perfectly. The next morning, Hutchins and Delgado tried a different approach. They rented a U-Haul truck, planning to load up and leave in broad daylight. But when they pulled out of the rental place, there were 12 motorcycles waiting in the parking lot, and those 12 motorcycles followed them all the way back to the house, parking in formation while Hutchins and Delgado unloaded their boxes. When they finally got on the road, heading out of town with the U-Haul packed, the escort followed. 12 bikes rolling down the highway in tight formation, right behind the truck. They followed for 50 miles, then 20 miles. Then another group of iron wolves picked up the escort from there. Tyler had called in favors from other motorcycle clubs in neighboring cities. The iron wolves had brothers everywhere, and word had spread about what these men had done to George. Clubs from 3 different cities volunteered to help maintain the watch. After 2 days of driving with a motorcycle escort, stopping at gas stations where bikers were always watching, trying to eat at restaurants where leather-clad men sat at nearby tables, Hutchins and Delgado. Carl Hutchins didn't sleep that night. He sat in the cramped motel room they'd rented, staring at the ceiling while Raymond Delgado snored in the next bed. Every time a motorcycle engine rumbled past on the highway outside, Hutchins flinched. They were everywhere, always watching. He'd tried to convince himself that the biker who'd called him was bluffing about having evidence. But then he thought about all the emails he'd sent, the spreadsheets on his laptop, the photos on his phone. If they'd somehow gotten into his accounts and he didn't put it past them anymore, they really did have everything. At 4 a.m, Hutchins finally shook Delgado awake. "We need to talk," he said. Delgado groaned and rolled over. "It's 4 a.m. I don't care. We need to talk about turning ourselves in." That woke Delgado up. He sat up in bed, glaring at Hutchins in the dim light from the parking lot. "Are you insane? Turn ourselves in? For what?" "For what?" Hutchins laughed bitterly. "For breaking that old man's arm. For running scams on elderly people. For everything we've done. Ray, they have evidence. Real evidence. Bank records, emails, everything. You don't know that." "Yes, I do. The guy on the phone knew details he couldn't possibly know unless he had access to our records. He knew victim names, amounts, dates, everything." Delgado ran his hands through his hair, thinking, "So what? They're bikers, not cops. That evidence probably isn't even legal. Does it matter?" Hutchins stood up and started pacing. "Even if it's not admissible in court, it'll lead the cops right to us. And meanwhile, these guys are never going to stop following us. You saw what happened when we tried to leave. They've got networks everywhere, other clubs helping them. We can't run from this." "I'm not going to prison," Delgado said flatly. "We're going to prison either way," Hutchins shouted. "The only question is whether we take responsibility now and maybe get some credit for cooperation, or whether we keep running until the cops catch us anyway." They argued for another hour. Delgado wanted to try one more time to lose their tail, maybe buy fake IDs and disappear to Mexico. Hutchins thought that was a fantasy. They didn't have those kinds of connections or that kind of money. They were small-time con artists who'd gotten greedy and hurt someone, and now they were facing real consequences. As the sun came up, painting the motel room in shades of orange and pink, they heard it again. The rumble of motorcycles. Hutchins looked out the window and saw 5 bikes pulling into the motel parking lot. Different bikers from yesterday, but the same colors. The Iron Wolves. "They found us again," Hutchins said quietly. Delgado looked out the window and something in him seemed to break. His shoulders slumped. How? How do they keep finding us? The answer was simple, though Hutchins and Delgado didn't know it. Brandon had installed tracking software on Hutchins's phone during one of his hacking sessions. Every move they made, every location they stopped was logged and shared with the Iron Wolves. There was nowhere they could go that the bikers wouldn't find them. By noon, Delgado finally agreed. They would turn themselves in, but not in this city. They'd drive to the next county over, somewhere the bikers didn't have as much presence, and they'd walk into a police station there. It was a reasonable plan, except that Tyler and his brothers had anticipated this exact move. When Hutchins and Delgado loaded up the U-Haul again and got on the highway, the motorcycle escort was waiting. This time it was even bigger, 20 bikes rolling in formation. The message was clear. There was no escape. They drove for 2 hours with their escort. Finally, Hutchins pulled off at an exit and headed toward a police station in a mid-sized town they'd passed through. The motorcycles followed them all the way to the parking lot, then formed a circle around the U-Haul. Not threatening, not blocking them in, just there. Tyler got off his bike and walked to the driver's window. Hutchins rolled it down, looking defeated. "You making the right choice?" Tyler asked. Hutchins nodded. "We're going to confess. Tell them everything." "Good. That's real good." Tyler looked back at his brothers. "We'll wait out here. Make sure you actually go through with it." Hutchins and Delgado walked into the police station looking like men heading to their execution. The desk sergeant, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, asked how she could help them. "We need to speak to a detective," Hutchins said. "We want to confess to multiple crimes." The sergeant's eyebrows rose. "What kind of crimes?" "Fraud, assault, theft, a lot of things." Delgado's voice was barely above a whisper. Within minutes, they were separated and placed in different interview rooms. Detectives were called in. The interrogations began. Hutchins, eager to cooperate and perhaps hoping for leniency, told them everything. He started with the assault on George Miller, explaining how the scam was supposed to work, how George had refused to pay, how things had escalated. He admitted that Delgado had grabbed the old man's arm, that the break had been deliberate, meant to intimidate him. Then he started naming other victims. The detective's eyes widened as Hutchins listed address after address, name after name. 23 elderly homeowners they'd scammed over the past year and a half. Amounts ranging from $3,000 to $12,000 per victim, a total of almost $200,000 stolen. In the other room, Delgado was singing a similar tune. He tried to put more of the blame on Hutchins, claiming the whole thing had been Hutchins's idea, but the detective wasn't buying it. They'd worked together. They were both guilty. While the confessions were being recorded, Brandon was driving to the same police station with a laptop bag. He walked in and asked to speak to whoever was handling the Hutchins and Delgado case. The desk sergeant was confused until Brandon explained, "I have evidence related to their crimes." "Extensive evidence. I think your detectives will want to see it." They brought him into a conference room where a senior detective named Lieutenant Morrison reviewed what Brandon had brought. The lieutenant's jaw actually dropped as he clicked through folders of bank statements, emails, victim lists, and documented transactions. "How did you obtain all this?" Morrison asked carefully. Brandon had anticipated this question. "Some of it came from public records. Corporate filings, property records, things like that. Some came from the victims themselves. We've been helping them document what happened." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either, and Morrison seemed willing to accept the explanation, probably because the evidence was so damning. "This is going to make the prosecutor's job very easy," Morrison said. "These guys won't be able to claim anything was a misunderstanding or accident. This shows clear intent and planning." "That's the idea," Brandon said. Outside in the parking lot, the Iron Wolves waited for hours. Some people walking into the station gave them nervous looks, but the bikers just sat peacefully on their motorcycles, bothering no one. Finally, Tyler's phone rang. It was Lieutenant Morrison. "Mr. Tyler," the detective said, "I wanted to let you know that Carl Hutchins and Raymond Delgado have been arrested and charged. Thanks to the evidence that was provided, we're looking at multiple counts of fraud, theft, and assault. They'll be held without bail pending trial." "What about the assault on my grandfather?" Tyler asked. "That's being treated as a separate and very serious charge. Given his age and the severity of the injury, the DA is considering enhanced penalties. These men are looking at significant prison time." Tyler felt tension he'd been carrying for days finally release. "Thank you, Detective." "I should thank you," Morrison said. "And your club. You could have handled this very differently. You could have taken matters into your own hands, and I don't think anyone would have blamed you. But you did it the right way. You gathered evidence, you put pressure on them legally, and you made sure justice happened through the proper channels." After Tyler hung up, he turned to his brothers and the other club members. "It's done. They're locked up." A cheer went up from the assembled bikers. Cole clapped Tyler on the back. Brandon grinned. They'd done it. Without violence, without crossing legal lines, they'd made sure the men who'd hurt their grandfather would face real consequences. The news spread quickly through the Iron Wolves network. Text messages flew back and forth. Phone calls were made. By that evening, everyone knew that the mission had been accomplished, but the story wasn't over yet. Over the next few weeks, the legal system ground forward. Hutchins and Delgado were formally charged in 4 different counties where they'd operated. The DA in Georges County made sure the assault charge was front and center, and they pushed for maximum penalties. George's medical bills were substantial. The surgery alone had cost $30,000, and insurance only covered part of it. The physical therapy was ongoing, but the DA's office helped George file for restitution, and they froze Hutchins and Delgado's bank accounts. Some of the stolen money was recovered, though not all of it. The 2 con artists had spent lavishly, buying expensive clothes, eating at nice restaurants, living well off their victims' fear and vulnerability. The other victims started coming forward once they heard about the arrests. Elderly men and women who'd been too embarrassed to report the scams, who'd thought they were alone in being targeted. The DA's office worked with each of them to document their losses and add charges to the case against Hutchins and Delgado. 3 months after the arrest, the case went to trial. 6 months had passed since the sentencing, and George's life had settled into a new normal. His arm would never be quite what it was before the attack, but he'd adapted. He learned to use his left hand for things he'd always done with his right. He modified his gardening tools so they were easier to grip. He kept his physical therapy appointments even though sometimes the exercises hurt and frustrated him. What surprised George most was how much his world had expanded. Before the attack, his life had been quiet and small. He talked to neighbors. He went to the grocery store. He watched TV. It was a peaceful retirement, but also a lonely one. He missed his wife every day, and sometimes weeks would go by where his only real conversations were with the checkout clerk at the supermarket. Now his house was rarely quiet. The Iron Wolves had adopted him as an unofficial club grandfather. Members stopped by regularly, often bringing their families. Danny the contractor came by to fix a leaky faucet George had been ignoring. Rick the paramedic helped him organize his medications. Frank brought his grandkids to play in George's yard while they talked about their shared experiences in Vietnam. Tyler, Brandon, and Cole still came every Sunday for dinner, but now they often brought other club members with them. George found himself cooking for 8 or 10 people on a regular basis, and he loved it. His kitchen came alive with laughter and stories. He learned about bike mechanics, about the brotherhood of the club, about the lives of these men who'd fought for him. The community's perception of the Iron Wolves had shifted too. The local newspaper had done a follow-up story 3 months after the trial, focusing on the club's new elderly protection program. They'd interviewed several seniors who'd received security checks and fraud prevention education from club members. The headline read, "Bikers Become Community Guardians." The senior center invited Tyler to speak at their monthly meeting. He brought along 5 other club members, and they talked about common scams, how to spot fake authority figures, and what to do if you felt threatened. The seniors were initially nervous, these proper elderly ladies in their church clothes sitting across from leather-clad bikers, but by the end of the presentation, they were asking questions and taking notes. One woman, Mrs. Henderson, raised her hand and said, "Young man, I have to admit I was frightened when you all walked in here. But you've been nothing but respectful and helpful. I apologize for judging you by your appearance, Tyler smiled. No apology necessary, ma'am. We know how we look. But we want you to know that if you ever need help, if you ever feel unsafe, you can call us. We're here for this community. That statement wasn't just talk. The club set up a dedicated phone line for elderly residents. It was staffed by volunteers who took turns being on call. In the first month, they got 12 calls. Some were legitimate concerns. Suspicious people in the neighborhood, aggressive salespeople, possible scam attempts. Others were just lonely seniors who wanted someone to talk to. The Iron Wolves handled all of them with patience and respect. One call came from a 90-year-old veteran named Harold, who said someone was trying to break into his shed. Cole and 2 other members rode over immediately. They found a raccoon had gotten stuck in the shed and was making a racket trying to get out. They helped free the raccoon, secured the shed, and then sat with Harold for an hour, listening to his stories from World War II. Harold called back a week later just to thank them again and to chat. The program grew. Other motorcycle clubs in the region heard about what the Iron Wolves were doing and started similar initiatives in their communities. A network formed, sharing information about scams and threats, coordinating responses, building relationships with law enforcement. Detective Morrison became an ally. He'd initially been skeptical of the bikers' involvement, worried they might cross legal lines or complicate investigations. But they'd proven themselves. When he had cases involving vulnerable populations, he sometimes reached out to the Iron Wolves for assistance. They had access to communities and networks that law enforcement didn't. They could gather information in ways that were unconventional but legal. One of Morrison's cases involved a group targeting elderly veterans with fake charity scams. The thieves were calling veterans, claiming to represent military support organizations and collecting donations that went straight into their pockets. Traditional investigation methods weren't yielding results. Morrison called Tyler. "I've got a problem you might be able to help with." Within 2 weeks, the Iron Wolves had identified the call center where the scam was operating. They did it through their network, talking to veterans groups, tracking phone numbers, following digital trails. They handed everything to Morrison, who got warrants and shut down the operation. 8 people were arrested. The partnership between the bikers and law enforcement wasn't always smooth. Some officers didn't trust the club. Some club members didn't trust the cops. But Tyler and Morrison worked to bridge that gap, showing both sides that cooperation could achieve things neither could accomplish alone. For George, watching all of this unfold was bittersweet. He was proud of his grandsons, proud of what they'd built from the terrible thing that had happened to him. But he also carried guilt. His injury had been the catalyst for change, but he sometimes wondered about all the other victims who hadn't had a biker gang to fight for them. He expressed this one Sunday during dinner. The table was full. Tyler, Brandon, Cole, Danny, Rick, and a few others. George pushed food around his plate and said quietly, "I've been thinking about the other people those men hurt. The ones who paid them, who never got their money back." The table got quiet. Tyler reached over and put his hand on George's shoulder. "Grandpa, what happened to them wasn't your fault. And we've been working on that too." Brandon pulled out his phone and showed George a website. "We started a fundraiser. All the money goes to victims of elder fraud. We've raised $12,000 so far. It's not enough to cover everyone's losses, but it's something." George felt tears prick his eyes. "You boys did that?" "The whole club contributed," Cole said. "And we've been doing fundraising events. Bike rallies, charity rides, raffles. People in the community have been really generous once they understood what we were doing." Rick added, "We're also working with the Victims Advocacy Center, helping elderly scam victims get connected with resources, legal help, counseling. Some of these people are really traumatized by what happened to them. Not just the financial loss, but the violation of trust." George wiped his eyes. "I'm so proud of you all. You've taken something terrible and made it into something good." "We learned that from you, Grandpa," Tyler said. "You always taught us that how you respond to adversity defines who you are. We could have responded with violence, could have tracked those guys down and hurt them bad, but that's not who we want to be." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but George kept thinking about what Tyler had said. How you respond to adversity defines who you are. It was true. He could have let the attack break him, could have become fearful and bitter. Instead, he'd chosen to heal, to trust, to stay connected to his community. His relationship with his daughter Linda had deepened. She called more often now, sometimes daily. She'd wanted him to move to Arizona to live near her, but George had refused. This was his home, his community, his life, but they'd found a compromise. She'd visit once a month and he'd fly out to see her for major holidays. His son Robert had taken more interest in George's life too. He'd met some of the Iron Wolves and initially been uncomfortable with them, worried about their influence on his sons. But seeing how they'd stood up for George, seeing the positive work they were doing, he'd come around. Robert even attended one of their charity bike rallies, riding on the back of Tyler's motorcycle, nervous but willing to understand this part of his sons' lives. The garden gnomes were still in George's front yard. He had added 2 more that his great-grandchildren had given him for his birthday. They made him smile every time he looked at them. He'd refused to be intimidated into removing them, refused to let the attack change this small joy in his life. His neighbors checked on him regularly. Mrs. Patterson from across the street came by every Tuesday with fresh-baked cookies. The young family next door invited him to their kids' birthday parties. The retired teacher 2 houses down started a neighborhood watch program, inspired partly by what had happened to George and partly by the example of the Iron Wolves. The whole street felt safer, more connected. People looked out for each other. Strange cars got noticed. Suspicious visitors got questioned. It was the way neighborhoods used to be, before everyone stayed inside their houses and never talked to their neighbors. One afternoon, about 8 months after the attack, George was in his front yard planting new rose bushes when a car pulled up. His heart rate jumped for a moment, an involuntary response to the trauma. But it was just a young woman, maybe 30 years old, getting out with a nervous smile. "Mr. Miller?" she asked. "That's me. Can I help you?" "My name is Patricia. I'm Carl Hutchins's daughter." She said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage. George froze, his gardening spade in his hand. He didn't know what to say. Patricia held up her hands. "I'm not here to make excuses for my father. What he did was terrible, unforgivable. I just wanted to come here,